Your systems don't die because they're bad. They die because no one knows how to keep them alive. In today's video, I'm going to be going through the three layers of documentation that keep systems alive, how I'm actively thinking about this, and how I am moving into the future. So most people think that documentation is equal to a Google Doc, basically a Google Doc that nobody reads. Basically, you create this Google Doc and then you expect someone to read it, but no one actively reads it. But that's why most systems die within weeks, ultimately because of that one simple tool. And ultimately, because after building backend ops for clients and also for myself, here's what I have been able to learn, which is that documentation lives in layers. It's not just a one overall arching thing that ultimately just happens through, just a simple Google Doc, but it happens in layers. And these layers are broken down into three separate layers, ultimately being number one being the why, which is the context layer. And through this context layer, we ultimately ask the question of what problem does this system solve? Ultimately asking what is the root core does what is the root core functionality does this system ultimately yield, and how can we actively understand the problem that it solves? Because ultimately, if this system's not solving a problem, then it's pretty pointless to build it out. And I think one of the most important modes is ultimately understanding that when we're actively solving this specific problem, we know that each and every single day that we are building this tool that ultimately solves someone's problem and is a solution. And through that, we are ultimately able to ask the next question, which is why does it exist? Why does this system ultimately need to exist? Is it handling lead flow? Is it actively just building this central nerve system that ultimately houses your backend ops infrastructure? Why does this system actively just need to exist on a day to day? And I think this creates a lot of context, because if you don't have this context layer where you're actively just understanding that, hey, we actively need to have this context within what we're actively building, then we're not actively serving a purpose. Because without this context of asking why does this system need to exist, what is the core thing that actively needs to happen within this system, then we're ultimately building blind. Because if there's no purpose of the system, then there's no point in it existing. And which ultimately leads us to asking the next question, which is who does it serve? And I think one of the most important things as well is ultimately understanding who this system is supposed to serve, because it cannot serve everyone. In as much as you may think that, hey, everyone else will benefit, ultimately that is not the use case, that is not the best use case for it. You ultimately need to understand that, hey, we're actively building this specific system for this specific client avatar, because they understand that, hey, they're having these problems, and we ultimately understand it from a root core that, hey, with this specific ICP or this specific client avatar, we know that they actively have these problems on a day to day. In as much as you may think that every single person may benefit from this solution, it's really, really difficult, especially in the early stages, at least from my own experience, to build a solution that ultimately yields massive success to every single person. And I think one of the most important modes is ultimately building through this context layer and asking the question of what problem does this system actively solve, and why does it exist? But ultimately, what ties everything together is for who. Because if you don't understand the who, then everything else just falls apart. You don't understand, hey, why does the system actively exist, and what problem are we actively solving for? And I think without this context, you're actively building blind. And without this, people follow steps blindly and break things the moment something changes. And I think when things change, and we're always living in a dynamic world where things are actively always constantly changing, this context ultimately builds the mode that you're able to build. And ultimately, through this context layer, you're able to gather the resources and the information that you need in order to move into the next layer, which is ultimately the process layer. And this is where the step-by-step SOPs, the screenshots, or the looms are actively built. Because I know one of the most important things, especially when you're building, is ultimately having documentation in these three layers where you're actively building out the context and then ultimately the process. How actively are you actively getting this done, and ultimately building these SOPs of saying, hey, this is how we're actively implementing and getting this process done through SOPs, screenshots, or looms. Because specifically, if you're able to build this process layer and tie it with the context layer, you're building the layer that you're building the overarching layer that you ultimately need to build in order to understand that these are the three layers of documentation that ultimately keep systems alive. Because in as much as you may have one specific layer, it's ultimately gonna yield you more ROI, at least from my experience, in terms of what we've been able to do if we build three different layers that ultimately serve in different aspects, through the context layer and also the process layer. And through this, we can ultimately make sure that, hey, the process layer is ultimately clear enough that someone with zero background could execute. Basically saying, hey, if you were to give this to someone that ultimately does not know who you are, what you're doing, or what problems you're actively solving for, they can actively understand this ultimately builds that that process layer that you can actively just use this as a plug and play. And without this, you're ultimately not yielding the most ROI that you possibly can in terms of this documentation. And I think with this this documentation, you ultimately understand that this is the backbone. It's what turns chaos into repeatability. And I think one of the most important modes is ultimately creating that repeatability, where you're ultimately able to just repeat this process and continuously just build on it, and making sure that, hey, we're tying context and we're tying the process layer together. And ultimately, this is building the two layers that ultimately allows us to document and hitting all fronts. But ultimately, this does not just function just the two of them. Ultimately, adding this this third layer, which ultimately adds a lot more depth, which is the execution layer, you're then able to build on that foundation and saying, hey, what happens when things break? Because in as much as you can build context, build a process layer, things are ultimately gonna break, and you need to understand what is the process or what is the execution layer that ultimately governs what happens when things do break, and then ultimately building around that. Because ultimately you need to understand that, hey, things are always gonna break. You're building systems, things aren't always gonna be 100% accurate. And how can you actively build the modes that ultimately govern and make sure that, hey, you're actively building in the right manner? And also you understand where the fallback processes are. Because if you don't understand, hey, if we fail in XYZ manner, what are the fallback processes that we need to ultimately have that govern how we're going to be building into the future? We ultimately understand that, hey, this is what we need to understand in terms of our fallback process, because if we fail, we have this fallback process that we've already built, which falls part of the execution there. But through this, you ultimately need to ask the one question that ultimately ties this together, at least that I found, which is ultimately asking, who do you escalate this to? Basically asking the question of, okay, we've built this, we've done all of these things. How can we then understand who is the go-to person that ultimately we need to, escalate this to? Who is the person that we're actively, just having within the system that we can ultimately have, as a chief source of knowledge that we can actively have in terms of advice, and also strategic partnership in terms of understanding that, hey, they're, part of our advisory council, if you will. And I've made the video about that a while back to speak about this strategic advisory board that ultimately you can escalate this to say, hey, we built XYZ, we're having this fallback process, we're executing in this manner. But ultimately, who is the person that you ultimately escalate this to that ultimately gives you feedback as well? Because I think feedback is one of the most important modes that ultimately allows you to build better and scale more into the future. Because without feedback, you ultimately just building blind, and we ultimately want to make sure that we have that super dialed and that we're actively just building on those fronts. But through that, that is where most documentation fails. Real systems fail gracefully, ultimately understanding that, hey, real systems ultimately fail gracefully, and they don't just fail rapidly. They ultimately understand that, hey, we're having these processes that we're actively building in terms of how we're building documentation, but in layers. And through these layers, we're actively building the moat that builds the next generation of Killer Chaos OS. And through this, we ultimately understand that, hey, this is where the magic happens when you treat most documentation as a living system. And I think one of the most important things that I've been super bullish on is ever since starting these videos is ultimately thinking of systems as a living system, because this ultimately is one thing that ultimately lives, it ultimately functions, and through this function it is ultimately able to create value. And how do we actively just understand that it's not just a a static dog, that documentation is not just a static doc that you drag and then you write a couple words and then you leave it and then you say, hey, the team is ultimately going to read this system and that's the end of that. No, it's ultimately understanding that, documentation happens in three layers. It happens in the context layer, it happens in the process layer, and it also happens in the execution layer. Then the question becomes, how can we actively just make sure that we're refining the processes, and also how we're actively thinking through, building this documentation, this documentation that we're actively building, this living system as well, and thinking of it, as an operating system. And I think, for me, I like to think of things as, operating systems in their own rights, to say, hey, like you and I, we're both operating systems in the sense that we have a brain, we have ways that we think through decisions, we have, means that we're actively able to solve problems as well, because through this internal operating system that governs how you're able to build into the future, and also how you're able to, solve problems as well. And I think, every time the system evolves, so does the doc. And it's ultimately just asking that, hey, this doc is not static, it is, a living system. It ultimately needs to make sure that, hey, it's constantly being refined and it never stops learning, because I think one of the most important modes is to never stop learning each and every single day. Even, in my internal operating system, it's one of the core things of every single day. I need to make sure that I'm learning at least one new thing that ultimately drives the mission of Killer Chaos OS forward, and not just Killer Chaos OS, but also me personally. And also understanding that, hey, this is why Killer Chaos OS works, because it's not just automation, it's an operating manual that adapts as the business grows. Each and every single day, we're ultimately making sure that, hey, this is ultimately, this OS, this operating system is ultimately adapting as the business grows and as the person grows, which is me. And making sure that, hey, because systems without documentations aren't systems, they're ultimately traps. And I think one of the most important modes in building these systems is also, just through this documentation. But through understanding that, it ultimately means that we're actively also understanding that documentation happens in three layers. And how can we actively ask the questions as well? Because I think, questions are one of the most important modes that get to the root of what it is that you're actively, building for from now and into the future as well. Because if we're able to understand the context layer, the process layer, and the execution layer, by simply asking these questions, we're able to reach a new level of understanding that is ultimately going to bring us forward in terms of the vision of Chaos Killer OS, where we're basically redefining industries and inspiring millions of people, and also just, having this $100 million worth of impact, this arbitrary number that we have. But ultimately, each and every single day, we also understand that, hey, we're going to get some things wrong, and that's okay. But ultimately, how are we going to be able to build better and scale better into the future, so that we're constantly just refining the machine each and every single day, using these videos as a platform, as our thinking OS, to actively just refine our thinking and how we're actively solving problems. And I think through this, we're gonna make so many mistakes, but the things that we're gonna get right, we're gonna make sure to super dial that in. And if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and I will see you guys in the next video.